The rhythm of death has a specific sound. It is not the steady beep of the cardiac monitor, though that was currently screaming its own silent alarm as the oxygen saturation numbers dropped to 88%. It is the breathing, the death rattle. My grandfather Arthur was breathing in the terrifying jagged cycle of Cheney-Stokes respiration, where the silence between breaths stretches so long you think it is over, until a sudden gasping intake of air startles the room back to life. I did not flinch. I just dipped the lemon glycerin swab into the water cup and gently ran it over his cracked lips. My shift at the hospice center had technically ended 3 hours ago, but I was not Nurse Hayes here. I was just Jen. My eyes felt gritty, as if filled with sand, and my scrubs were wrinkled from a 12-hour rotation, but I barely noticed the fatigue. I moved to the foot of the bed and tucked the thermal blanket tighter around his feet. His circulation was failing, and the mottling had started on his ankles, creating a map of blue and purple veins against his paper-thin skin. He always hated having cold feet, even in the summer. It was a small thing, but in the ICU, small things are all you have left to control. The heavy hydraulic door whooshed open, breaking the vacuum of the room. The air changed instantly. The sharp, stinging scent of isopropyl alcohol was strangled by the cloying heaviness of expensive perfume and the distinct musk of a wool suit that had just left a climate-controlled limousine. I did not need to turn around to know the atmosphere had shifted from a sanctuary to a boardroom. Richard and Catherine Hayes had arrived. My father did not look at the man in the bed. He did not look at the pale, sunken face of the father who had raised him. Instead, his eyes went straight to the digital chart hanging at the foot of the bed. He scanned the vitals with the same cold calculation he used to analyze quarterly earnings reports. My mother stood a step behind him, checking her reflection in the darkened window of the room, smoothing the lapel of her blazer. They looked like they were stopping by a ribbon-cutting ceremony, not a deathbed. Dr. Evans entered a moment later, looking exhausted, and my father pounced before the doctor could even check the patient. "Dr. Evans, we need a concrete timeline," my father said, and his voice was not a whisper. It was a projection. "We have logistics to manage. Indefinite waiting is the enemy of efficiency." The words hung in the air like smoke. I felt my stomach twist, a familiar knot of anxiety that formed whenever I had to confront him. I stepped forward, keeping my voice low, trying to maintain the peace. "Dad, please keep your voice down. Grandpa can still hear us." My mother let out a short, sharp breath that was almost a laugh. She adjusted her pearl necklace, her manicured fingers moving with nervous energy. "Jennifer does not romanticize biology. The man has been comatose for 2 days. His cerebral cortex has shut down. It is just a shell consuming resources now. There is no need for theatrics." I shrank back. The instinct to smooth things over, to be the good daughter, to not make a scene, fought against the rage rising in my throat. I looked at Grandpa Arthur, hoping he really was gone enough not to hear his only son discuss him like a depreciating asset. Dr. Evans sighed, the sound of a man who had had this conversation too many times with families in this specific tax bracket. "Mr. Hayes, the prognosis has shifted. His kidneys have shut down, and the acidosis is rising rapidly. We are maxed out on pressors to keep his blood pressure up. I suspect tonight will be the end. It could be hours, it could be minutes." The room went silent for a beat, but it was not the silence of grief. It was the silence of calculation. My father whipped out his iPad, tapping the screen with aggressive efficiency. He glanced at my mother and gave a curt nod. "The flight to Aspen leaves in 2 hours," he said. "If we leave now, we can make the private terminal with 20 minutes to spare." I stared at him, unable to process the words. "You are leaving?" It was not a question. "We have been planning this summit for 6 months, Jennifer." My father did not look up from his screen. "The investors from the tech merger are already there. This deal is the future of the company. It is what Arthur would have wanted." He turned to me then, and his eyes were like flint. "You are a hospice nurse. You are accustomed to this data set. You know the protocols. Your mother and I staying here to watch a monitor flatline has a 0 return on investment. It does not change the outcome." I reached out and grabbed his sleeve, my fingers bunching the expensive fabric of his suit. "But he is your father. He needs his family. Dad, please." Richard pulled his arm away, not violently, but with a firm detachment, as if removing a piece of lint. "He needs his legacy preserved," my father said, straightening his jacket. "He does not need an audience to watch him expire." That is sentimental thinking, Jennifer. And it is why you are a nurse and I am a CEO. Handle the paperwork. We will be reachable by satellite phone if absolutely necessary. My mother gave me a quick, pitying look that said she was disappointed in my lack of pragmatism, and then they turned. They walked out of the ICU without looking back once at the man who had built the empire they were rushing off to save. The hydraulic door hissed shut, sealing me back into the world of beeping machines and the rasping, terrifying sound of my grandfather taking one more lonely breath. The silence that followed their departure was heavier than the noise they had created. It settled over the room like a thick woolen blanket, suffocating the lingering scent of my mother's perfume. I stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, listening to the hydraulic hiss fade into the rhythmic, mechanical breathing of the ventilator. The fear of abandonment, that old childhood ache I felt whenever they left me with nannies to attend galas in the Hamptons, flared in my chest. But then the monitor chirped a low-priority alarm, signaling a slight drop in blood pressure, and the nurse in me overrode the daughter. I turned back to the bed. I was not alone. I was with the only person in this family who had ever let me sit on his lap and cry without telling me to be more efficient with my emotions. I pulled a chair close to the bedside and picked up the wash basin to empty it. When I turned toward the hallway door, I froze. Mr. Henderson was standing just outside the threshold, partially obscured by the shadows of the dim corridor. He looked like a fixture of the building itself, dressed in a charcoal suit that seemed out of date yet timeless. He was holding a leather-bound notebook and a fountain pen, his eyes fixed on the elevator bank where my parents had just disappeared. He did not look surprised. He looked resigned. He glanced at his watch, then scribbled something onto the paper with precise, deliberate strokes. 7:45 in the evening. Mr. Henderson, I whispered, not wanting to disturb the quiet. He looked up, his expression shifting from calculating to gentle, as he stepped into the room. He walked with the soft tread of a man who had spent decades navigating funeral homes and courtrooms. Jennifer, he said softly, nodding toward the bed. I came to secure the final signature for the medical power of attorney addendum, but I see the situation has evolved. He paused and looked around the empty room deliberately. Where is Richard? Your grandfather is in the active phase of dying. Surely he did not leave the premises. The question hung in the air, a trap I did not fully understand, but instinctively wanted to disarm. My chest tightened. I could not tell him that my father had done a cost-benefit analysis on his own father's death. I could not let the family name be tarnished by the truth of their callousness. He had to go. I lied, and the falsehood tasted like copper on my tongue. There is a liquidity crisis at the firm. An emergency board meeting. He was torn. Mr. Henderson truly broke up about it, but he said Grandpa Arthur would want the company saved first. Henderson looked at me over the rim of his spectacles. His eyes were gray and piercing, and for a terrifying second I knew he saw right through my desperate attempt to maintain the facade. He looked down at his notebook again and wrote another line. Business emergency, he murmured, more to himself than to me. I see. He capped his pen with a sharp click. You are a good granddaughter, Jennifer. Whatever happens, remember that. He squeezed my shoulder briefly, a gesture that felt more paternal than anything Richard Hayes had done in 20 years, and then he slipped out, leaving me alone with the night. The hours that followed blurred into a surreal loop of clinical tasks and exhausted vigil. The hospital entered its graveyard shift rhythm, where the lights dimmed and the world shrank down to the circle of illumination around the bed. I became a machine of care. I changed Grandpa's incontinence pad, cleaning him with warm wipes and barrier cream, maintaining his dignity, even though there was no one there to see it. I rotated his position every 2 hours to prevent pressure ulcers, propping his fragile frame with pillows, whispering to him the whole time. I read aloud from his favorite worn copy of The Great Gatsby, my voice cracking in the dry air. Around 3 a.m, hunger gnawed at my stomach, so I retrieved a turkey sandwich from the vending machine down the hall. The bread was stale, and the lettuce was wilted, and I ate it standing up by the window, staring out at the city lights of Boston, shivering slightly in the draft. My phone buzzed against the metal bedside table, startling me. It was a notification from Instagram. I swiped the screen, illuminating the dark room with blue light. It was a story update from my mother. She had posted it to her close friends list, a circle of elite socialites and business partners she assumed would validate her lifestyle. But she had forgotten in her carelessness that she had added me to that list years ago to boost her follower count. The photo was a masterpiece of composition. It showed 2 crystal flutes of champagne clinking against a backdrop of a roaring stone fireplace and a snow-covered mountain peak visible through a floor-to-ceiling window. The location tag read, The Little Nell Aspen. The firelight made the amber liquid glow with warmth, a stark, violent contrast to the sterile blue fluorescent light bathing my grandfather's dying face. But it was the caption that shattered me. In elegant white sans serif font overlaid on the image she had written, Sometimes you have to release the burdens of the past to embrace the heights of the future. I stared at the screen until the pixels blurred. A burden, that is what we were. I was the staff they left behind to clean up the mess, to wipe the fluids, and sign the death certificate, so they could toast to their freedom. I was not the caregiver. I was the janitor. A hot tear spilled over and tracked down my cheek, but before I could wipe it away, I felt a flutter against my palm. I dropped the phone on the blanket. Grandpa Arthur's hand, which I had been holding, absent-mindedly twitched. It was not a seizure. It was not a spasm. His fingers cooled and paper curled around my thumb. I looked at his face. His eyes were still closed, and his breathing was still that terrible, jagged rattle, but the grip tightened just a fraction. It was weak, barely the strength of a newborn, but it was deliberate. In that freezing room, with the taste of stale vending machine bread in my mouth, and the glow of my mother's cruelty fading on the screen, I squeezed back. He knew. Somewhere in the deep fog of his shutting-down brain, he knew who was holding his hand, and he knew who wasn't. I rested my forehead against our joined hands, and for the first time that night, the crushing weight of the room lifted. They had the wine and the fire and the money, but they were poor. I sat there holding the hand of a dying man, and I felt rich. At 4 a.m, the world simply stopped. There was no cinematic gasp, no final dramatic shudder. One moment, the jagged rhythm of his breathing filled the room, and the next there was only the low hum of the air conditioning. I watched the green line on the cardiac monitor stretch into a flat, continuous horizon. I did not call the nurses immediately. For a long, quiet minute, it was just the two of us suspended in the stillness. I reached out and gently closed his eyelids, which were still half open. Staring at a ceiling he could no longer see, my thumb brushed his cool forehead, and I leaned close, whispering into the silence. "Rest now, Grandpa. No more pain." Tears hot and fast spilled onto my cheeks, but my chest felt strangely light. The crushing anxiety of the last few days had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow but clean sense of peace. I had done my job. I walked him to the gate. 3 days later, the silence of the hospital room was replaced by the polite murmurs of Boston's elite, packed into the dark oak pews of Trinity Church. The air smelled of lilies and hypocrisy. Richard and Catherine had flown back from Aspen, arriving just in time to curate the perfect funeral. They stood at the front of the receiving line, a study in bespoke grief. My father wore a black suit that fit him with architectural precision, and my mother was draped in a vintage Chanel morning dress, her face hidden behind a chic veil that suggested devastation without ruining her makeup. I watched from the back row, feeling like an intruder at my own family's event. When Richard took the podium to deliver the eulogy, he did not speak of the man who liked to sneak peppermint candies, or the grandfather who taught me to fish on the Cape. He spoke of the titan of industry. My father taught me that a man's worth is measured by what he builds. Richard intoned his voice grave and practiced. He left behind a legacy of strength and unyielding vision. It was a press release disguised as a prayer. After the service, as the crowd shuffled toward the hearse outside for the procession to the cemetery, my mother spotted me. She glided over her heels, clicking on the stone floor. She reached out her arm, sensing the photographer from the Globe hovering nearby, eager for a shot of the grieving widow and daughter united in sorrow. "Come here, darling," she whispered through her teeth, her smile tight. "Let us show them we are holding up." She moved to embrace me, bringing that cloying, expensive perfume that now smelled like betrayal. My body reacted before my mind could intervene. I took a sharp step back. My heel scraped loud against the stone floor. Her arms embraced empty air. "Don't touch me," I said. The volume was low, but the tone was granite. Catherine froze. Her hands hovered in the space between us, and her eyes widened in genuine shock. The compliant, quiet daughter who always smoothed over every awkward silence had just drawn a line in the sand. People nearby turned to look, and for the first time in my life, I did not care about the scene. I turned and walked out the side door into the cold, biting wind, leaving her standing there with her staged embrace unfinished. The reading of the will took place the following afternoon in the library of Mr. Henderson's law firm, a room that smelled of old leather and furniture polish. The atmosphere was less like a family gathering and more like a merger acquisition. Richard sat in a wingback chair, casually checking his watch every few minutes. He had already called his broker twice in the waiting room, discussing the liquidation of the estate's real estate portfolio to fund his tech acquisition. I sat in the corner, my hands folded in my lap, invisible to them as usual. Mr. Henderson sat behind his massive mahogany desk. He looked older than he had at the hospital, his face drawn and serious. He opened a thick leather binder. "I, Arthur William Hayes, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament," Henderson began. My father leaned back, crossing his legs. He looked bored. Henderson read through the standard clauses listing the distribution of stocks, the primary residence on Beacon Hill, and the liquid assets totaling roughly $25 million. Every time a figure was mentioned, Richard nodded slightly, a reflex of ownership. And finally, Henderson read the residue of the estate is to be divided equally between my son Richard Hayes and my daughter-in-law Catherine Hayes. Richard slapped his knee and stood up smiling. Excellent, let us get the transfer documents started immediately, Arthur. I have a board meeting at 4 and I need to show proof of capital. Sit down, Richard, Henderson said. The voice was not loud, but it cracked like a whip. My father froze halfway out of his chair. He frowned, looking at the old lawyer with confusion that quickly turned to irritation. Excuse me, the reading is finished. Mr. Henderson removed his reading glasses and set them on the desk. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a sealed red envelope. He placed it in the center of the desk. The reading of the last will and testament is finished, Henderson said, his eyes locking onto my father's. However, there is a codicil, an amendment added by your father 1 month ago titled the last breath provision. The room went deadly silent. The air pressure seemed to drop. My mother stopped scrolling on her phone and looked up. A codicil, Richard scoffed. He never mentioned an amendment. He was senile. He probably didn't know what he was signing. He was examined by 2 independent psychiatrists on the day of the signing. Henderson cut in smoothly. He was declared fully competent. This document is ironclad. He picked up the envelope and broke the wax seal. The sound of tearing paper was the only noise in the room. Henderson unfolded the document and began to read. The assets listed above represent the accumulation of my labor, but the true value of a life is found in the people who stand by you when the labor is done. Therefore, the bequest of the entire estate to Richard and Catherine Hayes is subject to a condition precedent. My father's face had gone pale. What condition? Henderson continued, reading, his voice steady and unforgiving. If my son Richard and his wife Catherine choose to leave my side during my final transition to pursue personal leisure or financial gain, then they have proven that they value their time over my life. If they cannot give me 24 hours of their presence, a negligible cost for a lifetime of support, then they are unfit to steward the fruits of my life's work. Henderson looked up from the paper. The condition is simple. To inherit, Richard and Catherine must have been physically present in the ICU at the time of my death, as verified by my attorney or medical records. My father sank back into his chair as if his strings had been cut. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp. I sat frozen in my corner, watching the blood drain from their faces, realizing that the trap had been set long ago and they had walked into it with their eyes wide open, blinded by their own greed. Richard did not scream. A scream would have implied a loss of control. And Richard Hayes never lost control. Instead, he stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with a terrifying deliberation. The silence in the library shattered not with noise, but with the sheer force of his projection. He placed his hands flat on the mahogany desk, leaning toward Henderson like a corporate raider about to dismantle a hostile takeover. This is coercion, Richard said, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in the floorboards. It is a legal absurdity. You are telling me that my father, a man on high doses of morphine and palliative sedatives, drafted a complex codicil regarding his own deathbed attendance. It is classic undue influence. He turned his head slowly until his eyes locked onto mine. The look was not paternal, it was predatory. And I know exactly who influenced him. He took a step toward me. I shrank back into the leather wingback chair, my spine pressing against the buttons of the upholstery. You poisoned him, Richard said, his voice was smooth and cold. You capitalized on his dementia. You sat by his bed whispering lies about how we abandoned him, playing the martyr while you manipulated a dying man into signing away his legacy. Tell me, Jennifer, did you draft the language yourself, or did you find some ambulance chaser to do it for you? I didn't, I stammered, my hands trembling in my lap. The familiar nausea of conflict washed over me. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to fix it. My entire life had been built on the architecture of keeping Richard and Catherine happy, by smoothing out the edges so we could pretend to be a family. I will have your license for this, Richard continued, closing the distance. I will drag you through every ethics board in the state of Massachusetts. I will prove you committed elder abuse and financial manipulation. By the time I am finished, you won't be able to empty a bedpan in this city, let alone work in a hospital. My breath hitched. Being a nurse was not just my job, it was who I was. The threat struck the core of my identity. I looked at my mother, hoping for an intervention, but Catherine was studying her fingernails, her face unreadable, calculating her own survival. The pressure in the room was suffocating. The urge to capitulate to make the anger stop was overwhelming. I opened my mouth, ready to say the words that would restore the peace, ready to say, "Fine, take it. I don't want the money, just stop looking at me like that." Enough! The word cut through the tension like a gavel strike. Henderson had not moved from his chair, but his presence suddenly filled the room. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small silver USB drive. Your father underwent a comprehensive mental capacity evaluation by 2 forensic psychiatrists 1 hour before signing the codicil, Henderson said calmly. The report is 60 pages long and irrefutable. He was lucid. He was oriented. And he was heartbroken. Henderson plugged the drive into his laptop and turned the screen so it faced the 3 of us. Furthermore, Henderson continued regarding the accusation of manipulation. Mr. Hayes was insistent on documenting the context of his decision. He asked me to subpoena the security footage from the ICU corridor. Richard froze. For the first time, the arrogance flickered. Henderson pressed the spacebar. The video was grainy, but the audio was crystal clear. It was the hallway outside Grandpa's room. I saw myself looking exhausted and small, pleading with my father. Then I saw Richard. He looked impatient, checking his watch. And then his voice, tinny but unmistakable, filled the library. He is comatose. He does not know anything. Staying is useless. You staying is enough, that is your job. And then the second clip. The final nail in the coffin. Richard turned to Catherine as they walked toward the elevators. I will use his inheritance to make this death meaningful, rather than sitting there crying. It is an inefficient use of time. The video ended. The screen went black. The room was so quiet I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. I looked at the black screen, and then I looked at the man standing in front of me. I had spent 32 years trying to earn his approval, trying to be worthy of his attention. I had thought that if I was just good enough, if I was just helpful enough, they would finally love me. But the video stripped away the illusion. They did not leave because they had to. They left because they did not care. To them, I was not a daughter. I was a staff member. And Grandpa was not a father. He was a bank account. The fear that had been paralyzing me dissolved. It was replaced by a cold clarity that felt like the winter air outside. I stopped trembling. I unclasped my hands. I stood up. Richard was staring at the laptop screen, his jaw working as he tried to formulate a defense and tried to find a loophole in the digital evidence. He looked at Henderson. That was taken out of context. I was under stress. No, I said. My voice was steady. It surprised even me. Richard turned to look at me, and for the first time, he didn't see the nervous girl who fetched his coffee. He saw a stranger. You weren't under stress, Dad, I said, walking toward the desk. You were under a deadline. You made a calculation. I picked up the pen that Henderson had left on the desk. It was a heavy, solid brass instrument. You always talk about the opportunity cost, I said, looking him dead in the eye. I remember you teaching me that concept when I was 10. You said every choice has a value and a cost. Well, Dad, you ran the numbers. You decided that the opportunity cost of sitting by your father's deathbed was too high. You valued the Aspen networking trip more. I uncapped the pen. Richard's face flushed a deep, violent red. Jennifer, don't you dare. We can fight this. We can tie this up in probate for years. You will never see a dime. You miscalculated, and I continued ignoring his threat. You bet $25 million that you could neglect your father and still keep his money. You thought the market of human decency wouldn't correct itself, but it did. I looked at the document. The signature line waited for me. Jennifer Marie Hayes, and regarding the efficiency you worship, I said, leaning down, I think you will find this very efficient. I signed my name. The scratch of the nib against the paper was the loudest sound in the world. It was the sound of a bridge burning. I capped the pen and placed it gently on the desk. Richard looked as if he had been punched in the gut. He slumped against the bookshelf, the fight draining out of him as the reality of the financial ruin hit him. But it was Catherine who moved. The realization that the money status and lifestyle was evaporating triggered her survival instinct. She burst into tears, loud and theatrical. Jen. Oh, Jen, baby, please, she wailed, rushing toward me, her hands reaching out. We made a mistake. We were just so scared of losing him. We didn't know how to handle the grief. We are a family. You can't do this to your family. She tried to grab my hand, the same hand she had refused to hold at the funeral. Her touch felt clammy. I stepped back out of her reach. I looked at her tears, and I knew they were real, but they weren't for Grandpa, and they weren't for me. They were for the house in the Hamptons and the season tickets at the opera. I picked up my purse. I felt lighter than I had in years. You are right, Mom, I said calmly. We are family, and that is why I am doing this, because Grandpa wanted to teach you one last lesson. I walked to the heavy oak door and opened it. I looked back at them one last time. Richard defeated by his own logic. Catherine drowning in her own vanity. Money can buy the best lawyers and the best doctors and the first-class tickets, I said. But it cannot buy forgiveness, and it certainly cannot buy back the time you threw away. I walked out and closed the door, leaving them in the expensive silence of their own making. The seasons in Boston change fast, but the change inside the stone walls of the estate on Beacon Hill was even more profound. 1 year had passed since I walked out of Mr. Henderson's office, and the house that once stood as a cold monument to Hayes' family ambition was now alive. We had renamed it the Arthur House. The heavy velvet drapes that used to block out the sun to protect the antique furniture had been pulled down, replaced by sheer linen that let the morning light flood the grand foyer. The smell of lemon polish and dust was gone, replaced by the scent of fresh lavender and baking bread from the kitchen where families were actually allowed to eat. It was no longer a museum. It was a home for those who had nowhere else to go. For their final chapter. I stood by the bay window in what used to be my father's study. The mahogany desk where he had plotted hostile takeovers was gone. In its place was a hospital bed adjusted to a comfortable recline, where Mrs. Higgins, a retired schoolteacher with terminal lung cancer, was watching the birds in the garden. Beside her, Sarah, a young nursing student I had hired 2 weeks ago, was nervously adjusting the flow on the oxygen concentrator. Sarah's hands were shaking slightly. She was looking at the machine, not the patient. "Sarah," I said softly, stepping closer. "The numbers are fine. Look at her shoulders." Sarah looked up, blinking. "Her shoulders. She is tensing up," I explained, moving to the bedside. I placed a hand gently on Mrs. Higgins's forearm. "The machine treats the hypoxia, Sarah. You treat the fear." I watched as Sarah took a breath, lowered her shoulders, and mimicked my gesture. Mrs. Higgins let out a long sigh, and her eyes fluttered closed. The room settled into a peaceful rhythm, accompanied by the faint sound of a cello playing from the living room down the hall, where a music therapy volunteer was playing Bach. This was the legacy Arthur Hayes had actually wanted. Not a conglomerate, but a sanctuary. My phone vibrated in the pocket of my scrubs. I pulled it out instinctively, expecting a text from the night shift pharmacist. Instead, it was a notification from my personal email. The subject line read, "Update United States versus Richard Hayes and Catherine Hayes." I stared at the preview text. The words indictment, wire fraud, and asset seizure jumped out. It seemed that without the influx of $25 million to cover the losses from his failed Aspen deal, my father's financial house of cards had collapsed. He had tried to move money he did not have to hide debts he could not pay. The logic of the market he worshipped had finally turned on him. I hovered my thumb over the screen. A year ago, seeing this would have sent me into a spiral of guilt. I would have called Henderson and asked if there was a way to help, if I could bail them out. But as I stood there in the sunlight, hearing Mrs. Higgins breathe comfortably, I felt nothing but a distant, quiet sadness. It was the feeling you get when you hear about a storm in a country you do not live in anymore. I did not open the email. I swiped left and tapped delete. I slid the phone back into my pocket and turned to Sarah. "You are doing great. I am going to step into the garden for a moment." The garden was my grandfather's favorite place, and we had restored it to its original wild beauty. The manicured hedges my mother loved were gone and allowed to grow soft and natural. I sat on the stone bench beneath the old oak tree, the wood warm against my back. I pulled a small leather notebook from my pocket. I had started writing in it months ago, a way to organize the thoughts that had been suppressed for 3 decades. I opened it to a blank page and uncapped my pen. I wasn't writing for myself anymore. I was writing for the person I used to be, and for anyone else who felt small in the shadow of a hospital room. To you, the one holding the cold hand of someone you love, while the world keeps spinning outside. I know how loud the silence is. I know you feel like you are drowning in medical jargon and the pressure to be practical. There will be people wearing expensive suits and speaking in confident voices who will tell you that what you are doing is inefficient. They will tell you that grief is a weakness and that there are more important things to manage, like assets and timelines. They will try to make you feel foolish for caring about the temperature of the room or the moisture on a pair of dry lips. Do not listen to them. I have seen the end of life more times than I can count. I have seen CEOs and senators and janitors take that final breath. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that in those final varying moments, nobody asks for their portfolio. Nobody asks to see their awards. The only thing that matters, the only currency that has any value when the lights go out, is presence. It is the feeling of skin against skin. It is the knowledge that they are not leaving this world alone. You are not just sitting there. You are the anchor. You are the bridge. You are the most important person in the room. And if the people telling you to move on are the ones who share your last name, please remember this. DNA is just a biological sequence. It is accidental. Family is deliberate. Family is not about who is in the will, it is about who is in the waiting room at 3 a.m. If your heart is soft, do not let them convince you it is a defect. Your sensitivity is your superpower. It is the only thing that keeps humanity from becoming a spreadsheet. Protect your peace, draw your lines. And if they choose to walk away, if they choose the ski trip or the board meeting or the easy way out, let them go. Do not chase them. Do not beg them to see the value of what you are doing. They are chasing a ghost. You stay. You hold that hand until the very end. Because when you walk out of those hospital doors, you will not carry the weight of regret. You will carry the only inheritance that cannot be taxed or stolen or lost. You will carry the quiet, absolute peace of knowing that when it mattered most, you were there. That is the real legacy. You have just finished hearing the ICU clause. While the legal drama of the last breath provision is a work of fiction, the emotional landscape Jen navigated is undeniably real. It is a terrain that many of you walk through every single day, often in silence and rarely with applause. We currently live in a culture that is deeply obsessed with the Richard mindset. We are conditioned to optimize our schedules, maximize our returns on investment, and view time strictly as a commodity to be traded for visible success. We praise the hustlers, the builders, and the people who are too busy because we have dangerously equated busyness with importance. In this frantic race, it is far too easy to view moments of stillness like sitting by a hospital bed as unproductive time or a waste of potential resources. But this story was written to challenge that cold definition of productivity and to offer a new metric for success, one that isn't measured in inheritance stocks or job titles, but in the simple, profound power of presence. We all have an Aspen in our lives. In the story, Aspen represented the peak of success for Richard, a place of networking luxury and future potential. But for you, it might be that critical Zoom call during dinner, the email you feel compelled to answer at a child's recital, or the vacation you prioritize over visiting an aging relative. The hard truth this story asks you to confront is the true nature of opportunity cost. Richard believed the cost of staying in the ICU was losing a business deal, but the real cost was losing his humanity. The lesson here is practical and urgent. Work will always wait. Deals can be rescheduled and money can be re-earned, but the last breath of a loved one happens only once. There is no redo button on death, and when you are forced to choose between your career and a crisis, it is vital to remember that your career will not hold your hand when it is your turn to lie in that bed. This realization leads us to reconsider how we view strength and softness. Society often treats people like Jen, the caregivers, the listeners, the ones who absorb the emotions of others, as soft or weak, telling them they need to toughen up to survive in the real world. Yet looking at the outcome of this story, Jen didn't win because she became cold like her father. She won because she leaned into her nature. To the caregivers reading this, please know that your empathy is not a liability. It is your greatest strategic advantage. The ability to sit in discomfort to witness pain without looking away and to offer comfort is a form of endurance that requires more grit than any boardroom negotiation. You are the infrastructure of humanity, and you should never let anyone make you feel small for being the one who stays. Perhaps the most difficult yet liberating realization offered here concerns the boundaries of family. We are often conditioned to believe that family is an unconditional obligation, that simply sharing DNA means we must endure toxicity, neglect, or abuse without complaint. The ICU clause offers you permission to reject that premise. Jen's true victory wasn't securing the money, it was the moment she drew a line and realized that the title of father or mother is earned through behavior, not biology. If you're holding on to a relationship solely out of guilt or tradition, while that person drains you or treats you like a resource, you have the right to walk away. You have the right to draft your own clause. For you do not have to set yourself on fire just to keep others warm, especially if they are the ones holding the matches. As you move forward from this story, I invite you to reflect on your own life. Consider what your personal ICU clause might look like, not a legal document, but the non-negotiable standard of love and respect you require from the people in your life. Ask yourself who the Jen is in your world, the person doing the emotional heavy lifting of planning birthdays and checking on the sick, and ask if you have thanked them or simply assumed they would handle it. Most importantly, consider who would be in the room if your life ended tonight, not the people who would post a tribute on social media, but the ones who would sit in the uncomfortable plastic chair holding your hand. Those are the people you need to invest in today. You cannot control how long you live, and you cannot always control the wealth you leave behind, but you have absolute control over the legacy of your character. The next time you are faced with a choice between efficiency and empathy, I hope you remember the beeping monitor in Arthur Hayes' room. I hope you choose the hand squeeze over the handshake and the unglamorous, quiet, holy work of just being there. In the end, love is the only thing we take with us, and it is the only thing we leave behind.